So this is part two of the trip. We've made our way from Auckland down to Rotorua, which is the volcanic region. We went through the Hobbit area as we got here, and we spent 3 days in this area. And this is the really geologically active area region that I want to talk to you about. So some of you may have heard of the Pacific Ring of Fire. And the Ring of Fire is a reference to this, taking a look at all the places where there's tectonic activity as these plates, they're moving around the Earth, plate tectonics, are moving around and crashing into each other. Something very interesting, by the way, I can't wait to tell you, so I'm just telling you now. In the North Island and the South Island, in the North Island, the Pacific plate is diving underneath the Indo-Australian plate, but in the South Island, it's riding over. And so it's kind of a scissored down on the top and up and over on the South Island. And New Zealand has an awful lot of earthquakes. You might have heard about in this area right at the tip of the arrow, if you can see that, is the place where the town of Christchurch is located. And Christchurch was really hurt about 10 years ago by a very, very strong earthquake that very sadly leveled a lot of the buildings and lost lives. In any case, this is the Ring of Fire. This is the plate, the interface really, of an awful lot of geological activity. Here are now some of that details. Here we can see the interface of these two plates, so the Pacific and Indo-Australian plate over here on this side, the west side. And here is the real line of those two plates hitting, and that line follows a ridge of mountains that are in the South Island. Here, the area that I was talking to you about where our trip has taken us is Rotorua, and that's this volcanically active region that includes White Island out here, the one that had erupted while people were visiting. So we started at Auckland, we made our way down through and into this volcanically active area called Rotorua. Here are some of the places where we're seeing active volcanoes. They're highlighted, and White Island right here was the one that erupted. It was actually more of a water eruption, a steam escape that we think a lot of water went down and hit, of course, that superheated and came up as a blast of steam. But Rotorua is a very active town. In fact, when you're high up, as we were, on a cool day, these were warm days when we were there, but on some cool days, you can just look down at the town and you see steam rising up from all within neighborhoods and even downtown. So that's the White Island. And I mentioned that there was a death while we were there. So the eruption happened in early December, and a person died who was on that island on the 22nd of December while we were there. So I think the total is 17 right now. I don't think anybody's died since. So 3 nights in Rotorua. Here, telling you a little bit about what I just said, which is the Pacific plate is diving under the Indo-Australian plate, so that in this region right here, there's a lot of pressure that's pushing magma and heated rock up like this. Here's that interface of these two plates. So this area right in here is this area right here. There's White Island. This is from a sign in one of the geological parks. An area near Rotorua is called Hell's Gate. It's like Yellowstone, in which there's an awful lot of geological activity. Under our feet and in this geological park, they're trying to show you and help you to interpret a lot of what you're seeing. So if you've made your way to Yellowstone before, you know about fumaroles, in which some of the heat's coming up and there's acid breaking down some of the soil. So you get kind of a muddy pot in that area. We talked about this actually when on my trip to Iceland, where we saw the same kinds of things. So you can read this if you want. I'm not going to spend much more time on this. The water that's coming up superheated then is going to run off And here is a waterfall. You can see it's 40 C, reminding you that our core body temperature is 37 C. So this is above our core body temperature. And most of you know it is about 98.6 or 99 degrees Fahrenheit. 98.6 is 37 C. So this was a very warm waterfall. Here they said that Maori warriors would come here, as it says, to after a battle to bathe and salve their wounds. This is just the conversion factor for those of you that want to be able to convert 40 C to Fahrenheit to help you out. 40 C divided by 5, and so 40 divided by 5 is 8, and then you multiply it by 9, and gives you 72. That's how many degrees Fahrenheit above freezing. Freezing is 32 Fahrenheit, so 72 and 32, 104. In any case, as this superheated water and acidic gases make their way up, some of the minerals and materials of the soils are going to be broken down into these kind of mud pots. And so this thing was almost like an organ going off with these different pots. And of course, this all changes over time. And as rainfall comes down, things and the dynamics change. And so if you lived in the region, it might be fun to come back every so often and see how things are different. These are some of the big pools. It was a pretty day walking around Rotorua, but it reminded me a lot of Yellowstone. Here was something that I had not seen, and you might think would happen, but in fact I haven't seen a lot of this in these geologically active areas. This is a place where there's some splattering going on, and so there's a buildup of like this little bitty volcano right here. Here's Amy over here on the bench. Well, we didn't stay a long time because there's a warning sign that said every few days this thing belches out big, steamy splats of mud that can get you right here on the walkway, and it could burn you severely. So they warned you about coming up here. It seemed to be pretty well vented when we were there, and so there didn't seem to be any sealing over that would have spewed some mud. These are just more of the pools. The pools, as you can see, can be 100 C boiling pots or even higher. If you add salt to the water, the pot's going to get potentially boil at above 100 C. Here was something kind of weird. There's a bird called a pied stilt, and it's in this area. And as I'm sitting looking at these acidic, hot pools, I'm seeing this wading bird flying over and eating stuff on the shorelines. And it was this pied stilt flying over. So here you can see it in part of its journey over these pools. Some of the real steamy areas that we saw, some multicolored. We know that these are different kinds of bacteria-like forms. They're called archaea or extremophiles, but they're related to bacteria, a very primitive kind of life form. And we think that the different colors of the different zones where different archaea live. This is a big walkway, of course, with people all around this big pool. I think in New Zealand, this was the largest pool that we got to see. Here's an area that's actually closed off due to some volcanic activity here, so I could only take this picture of the walkway around another very, very large pool. Here, just an accumulation of all sorts of materials. This is, well, it was a geyser that they said goes off every day at about 10:30. And it was on our way on the road. We had tickets already from the travel agent, part of our package. And so I was intrigued. Gosh, how is it that this thing's so predictable? I mean, you know, Old Faithful, so this really must be something. Well, then we learned some interesting aspects. We felt like we were conned. This was in a regular park where we saw all the other stuff. But as this interpreter told us, here, the woman with the microphone, she said that in this area, it was a prison camp, and that prisoners would come over to this particular region for the warm water, and they would bathe themselves. And what they noticed was that when some of their soap, I guess, went down into some of the cracks, the soap would cause one of these geysers to erupt. So you could predictably get this geyser to erupt by allowing soap down. So lo and behold, that's what this woman proceeded to do. Why does this geyser go off every day at 10:30? Because this lady takes out about 4 bars of soap and drops them down this hole. And then she backs off. And this is the accumulation, I guess, of a lot of that soapy material. So it seemed a lot more like a Disney show than something realistic. They assured us that if they didn't drop the soap down the hole, every few days this geyser would erupt. But that's what the eruption looked like. It was a true geyser eruption, but stimulated by dropping down these bars of soap. And I'm sure my son could explain to me the chemistry and the reactions here if he looked into it. But in any case, we walked away from this particular thing to see feeling a little bit taken. Farther down along the road, we got to see something called Craters of the Moon. And in this particular region, here in this very hot area, just underneath the rocks that you're walking on, were fumaroles. And the fumaroles were places where steam was coming up. So you'd be walking around and there's just steam coming up. And this is what that looked like. So this is from one of the boardwalks that you walk on all around here to get to see these. And in this real steamy area, then trees are not really successful. There's some other lower vegetation that is. And then surrounding, you can see trees. So this is an area beyond the normal region of the fumaroles. There's also, here are some of the bigger cracks and steam coming off. That's not fog, that's really heated steam coming out of the ground. And that was such a contrast for me with ferns growing on the sides of the cliff, which I associate with cool moisture. So steam and ferns didn't really seem to go together. But here, there's such differences in a close proximity. I thought that was really neat. In some of the other regions around, so in the surrounding vegetation, there were some very, very tall ferns, cycads, that were just wonderful to see. And so this is a couple shots of the same kind of area, showing you some of the beautiful trees that were in these areas. And then finally, when we're in Rotorua and we're talking with our just spectacular hosts at a bed and breakfast, we're talking about things that they thought we should be sure to see. And he said, well, you should go see our redwood forest. I said, what do you mean redwood forest? He said, yeah, we have this forest of redwood trees. They're California redwoods. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, but it's in New Zealand. We had just seen California redwoods in 2018. So that's about 2 years before, a year and a half before, we got to see the real redwoods in California. And the history is that a little over 100 years ago, people in New Zealand were experimenting with what kinds of commercial trees could be grown in New Zealand. And they reasoned that California redwoods might do very, very well. In fact, they do. They created a sample forest of giant redwoods, which are really, really big. In fact, that's quite surprising. In close to 100 years, that's how big some of these trees are. Here they've got platforms and they have walkways between the redwoods, this forest of redwoods. So there's the map showing you the little walkways that you can go on. This one, they said their tallest tree was planted in 1901, so that'd be right now 119 years ago. And it's grown really, really fast. So when I asked, well, so were redwoods going to be a good commercial tree? What we learned from, not from experts, but from some of the local people, they said they understood that the redwoods grew so fast that the quality of the wood was not good. It wasn't good enough for whatever purposes, I guess construction. And so they weren't raising them, but they decided to protect this sample plot. And so here in Rotorua, you can go and see the redwoods. It's a nice park-like atmosphere. There's trails through it, and people jog and ride their bikes. So it's not just this commercial site with people walking through. They also have you can see little lamps on their map that light up at night, so you can go on this walkway at night. We didn't. we spent a lot of time in the California redwoods, and we really enjoyed that. So here, showing you this big volcanically active zone. We looked at this map before. Just south, so I'm going to go back, just south of Rotorua. So we made our way down here. We're on our way to Taupo, and just south of Lake Taupo, down over here. So a lot of what I just showed you were the geological active regions in here. Now just south of Lake Taupo are these other mountains. They're volcanoes, and they're active volcanoes. And lo and behold, so this one erupted, it says 10 times since 1861. And here we were on the east side of this mountain range in the morning. We had beautiful lighting, the clouds cleared away, and we just couldn't believe we had to stop by the side of the road, as other people were, just to look at the mountains. Very, very beautiful. This one right next door is Mount Doom. This one's frequently climbed. It's an all-day trip and quite an accomplishment to make your way up and down. And both of these become real good trails for people to take, but we weren't stopping to do that. We walked some trails, but just not these. Here, again now, on our way, still on the North Island, but making our way down to Wellington. Here's what a lot of the countryside looked like. And what we were surprised at was it had the feel of the Hobbit region. And in fact, an awful lot of New Zealand was this, with, as you'll notice, lots of animals grazing on grasses. And in fact, they plant grasses, different kinds of grasses that are going to be the best for growing. So in that we might have hybrid corn, they have different strains of grasses that they're going to cultivate here that are the best for growing in these environments, and thus raising a lot of cattle and sheep. Here's some export facts up in the upper left. Dairy, eggs, and honey are in fact some of the greatest. A lot of sheep meat, so mutton, and then relatively little wood, although there's an awful lot of forests of planted trees. This is, I don't know, maybe some native trees. I took this picture out of a bus when we were on a field trip, and the row of trees just really caught me, and with the cattle here, this almost looks like it should be a cattleman picture. Nonetheless, it really captured some of the landscape. More of the native zoology. So what I'm doing right now is I'm not just doing regional anymore. I tried to cluster together a lot of the wildlife we saw. We went to a number of places where birds are breeding, and so there's colonies, and this particular gull was very abundant with its chicks. You just walked right by on our way to see the giant albatross, actually, and we'll talk about that later. Here's some of the frogs that are native to New Zealand. It's kind of an interesting thing. I talk to people, and, I'm a zoologist. Well, what do you study? Well, I study something that you don't have. So why are you in New Zealand? Well, New Zealand doesn't have any salamanders. I was also in Iceland. Iceland doesn't have any salamanders. Before that, we were in Alaska. Alaska does have salamanders, but not in the region that we were at, in the southern areas of Alaska. That's where they'll have a few salamanders. I think one species, actually. Here in New Zealand, because of plate tectonics and the separation of New Zealand from the Americas, we have the separation here of the three very small nocturnal species of frog found in New Zealand. And I never encountered them. So in my entire time there and moving around, we never heard them and we didn't see them. There is an introduced species, of course, a frog that we were listening to, but we didn't hear any of the native species. New Zealand has 110, more than 110 species of lizards. This is the skinks. I was talking to you about some endangered skinks earlier. This is one of them. This is alive and in one of the conservatory places, so kind of a zoo, but a bit more of a natural environment that we were taking some pictures. And now the animal that I really was interested in going to New Zealand to see, and these are tuatars. So the tuatara, and this is a live animal that we saw again in one of these sort of zoos that was in the North Island. The tuatara, and these animals are maybe a meter long, not quite a meter long with the whole big tail. If they're the really big ones, they could be, gosh, mixing my measurements here, but about a foot long, and they're pretty young. I try to tell people why tuataras are special, and they see them and people often think, well, it's just a lizard. No, it's not. If you take a look at the major groups of vertebrates here, sadly leaving out the amphibians and the fish, we can see that lizards and snakes belong to their own group. Turtles, clearly different. Birds get their own thing. Birds are reptiles now. Crocodiles and alligators just as well. So you've got these four main reptile groups plus tuataras, of which there's just the one species. Actually, I think there's two species, but in any case, it's just very, very few species down here that we're looking at. And the break is from a long time ago. So the last common ancestor is 250 million or so years ago. Here's a picture that I took of one of the living tuataras. Here's its skull that's very special with these openings in the back. And so here's a list of the kinds of things they like. How have I known tuatars? Tuatars from New Zealand used to be widely abundant, but then the invasive species have really trimmed them back, and tuatars survived because there were a few islands where we had not introduced enough invasive species to kill them off. Now they're only in protected areas and on protected islands. But the way I knew them was zoos in the United States, I think starting back in the early 1980s, zoos in the United States, a few zoos, were gifted a few breeding pairs, or what we hoped were breeding pairs of tuatars, and people like my colleagues, because I study reproductive biology of amphibians and reptiles, my colleagues, were interested in trying to get the tuatars to breed. And my understanding is that there were restrictions on the loans or the gifts of these specimens of tuatars. And the condition was that the zoos could not exhibit the tuatars unless they got them to reproduce. And then they could exhibit the offspring. So I know of a couple places that they had tuatars, and one was the St. Louis Zoo. So when I arrived here at Blackburn College in 1989, one of the things I did was took people, some of my students, on behind the scenes tours of St. Louis. So I'd get a hold of the people there at the zoo, and we'd do a behind the scenes tour, and that's how you could see the tuatars, because you could see them in enclosures that are not on display, and they were trying to get them to breed. Well, interestingly, to my knowledge, they have not got them to breed, and the only place they did get them to breed is in New Zealand. And I'll tell you that we got to visit one of the places where they did get the tuatars to reproduce, and it was an enclosure in a natural environment. And so it was the first documented cases of captive breeding of tuatars. And it was done in a very natural environment. I was standing right next to tuatars, we'll show you a little bit later, and I was marveling, what was it about this particular environment that we could not simulate in the United States? And we don't really know. It might be that the animals just weren't old enough. These are very long-lived animals. It says over 100 years. It may be that they're waiting to reproduce until they're in their 30s. We don't know. And so it might have been the animals were too young. So that's one picture I took, and then the tuatara does this. Blah. Actually, I took an awful lot of pictures because he kept sticking his tongue out and, I don't know, maybe licking off his lips. But I was interested in the shape of the tongue. There are migratory eels that move from the ocean back upstreams, and we were in a natural environment where they had streams naturally connected. These were not in any way enclosed. It was just this nature preserve that we're in, had streams that went to the oceans, and they had eels that came up the streams. And in the natural environment, but in this protected area, they fed the eels. And so the eels would congregate there. when we arrived at this park, Bruce Wilderness Area, we came in, checked in. I saw somebody at the information center, and like I regularly do, I told them about being a zoologist and sort of one of my interests, and maybe there's something I should see. And the woman who was greeting us said, "Oh, and you should see the eels. In fact, I'm going to go do a show with the eels. I'm going to go to the area where the eels are out at the stream, and you should come over." So we did, and when we arrived, there were about 100 people gathered around this big stream on a bridge. And we arrived just in time where the lady in her little spiel said, and I'll pick a couple of you to hand feed the eels if you'd like. And Amy and I both raised our hands, and lo and behold, we were picked. So there were 4 of us that were selected. They had waders for us to put on. This is a bit of some of the details of what these eels are. They're very large, 2 meters long, 2 meters long. Their diameter, if you think about the end of a baseball bat, the big fat end of a baseball bat, they're thicker than that. They're bigger than that. So these are big animals. Yes, they have teeth. They're fish. And what we did was waded into the waters where there were hundreds of these eels. This picture I took has the mouth open, gaping upward, and the animal was begging essentially for food. Here's my feet over here with these big eels all around. And of course, if I were to have fallen over, I imagine that the eels would have bit on us and it wouldn't have been very pleasant. But for whatever reason, I was just delighted as could be. So here, look at the size of this eel right over here. They were all down here. They had some leftover duck food. They handed us down a bucket and a little big spoon. Actually, it's a great big spoon. And we just kind of spooned this into the water. And then, and again, there's like 100 tourists around here, probably native New Zealanders. And then the lady, knowing I'm a zoologist and Amy is a zoologist, she says, "Hey, would you like to feed them some dead mice?" And I just didn't imagine that a lot of people would have responded yes. But we said, "Oh, yeah, sure, yeah, sure." And so they have traps in this protected area, and they're trying to kill the mice. And so every day they're catching mice in the traps, and then they bring the dead mice and feed them to the eels. So we grabbed the tail of these dead mice and hand fed into the open mouth, like over here, the little eels. And I gave the lady my phone, and she took this picture. So we're having an awful lot of fun. Posing with these great big eels. I guess if I had thought it through and was a little less enthusiastic, hard to imagine, I would have been rightly frightened a little bit, because you could trip over these eels, and then if I fell in the water, I think they would have been biting onto us just to see if we were something they should eat. So it probably wasn't a good place to be as excited as I was, but I was. Here's another thing they had at this particular protected area. This is an indoor area that they had, and see if you can figure out what is going on in this picture. Well, kiwis are nocturnal. And so if you want to see them, you have to see them under red light during the daytime, where the kiwi thinks it's nighttime. And this particular kiwi was famous in all of New Zealand because it's an albino. Unfortunately, his little head didn't stick out over here, and I couldn't get a picture of his face, but that's his head right over here. And there's the back of this albino kiwi. Now, a little bit more about kiwis. Kiwis have this very, very long beak. They search around in the leaf litter or can eat pretty much just anything they can find. But they do something that's pretty amazing. They lay one really big egg. And so look at the scale of this egg to this bird. We went into another one of the areas where they had a kiwi hatchery. And throughout New Zealand, there's a few places, this was one of just a few that they have in New Zealand, where when people stumble upon a kiwi nest, then they maybe find an egg that got abandoned, or a dog went in and killed the kiwi, and there's the egg. People then have an egg, a kiwi egg, and they want to know, look, is there a chance that we can incubate it? And so sometimes there's damaged eggs that are cracked. A piece of the shell could even be missing. And of course, they got to address it right away or the egg will dehydrate, dry up, and there would be no chance for the little embryo. In any case, they bring them in here and they hatch them on a regular basis and then can return the kiwi to the wild or to some of the protected areas. And it's been quite successful. So we got to go through a kiwi hatchery and see that. Here at the Wellington's National Museum was a mount. Actually, it was on a floor underneath a cabinet. You had to work for this. So I'm laying down on my belly in the museum to get this picture. Here's somebody's leg over there. But I wanted this picture because it just blows me away. This, of course, is the skeleton of a mother kiwi with an egg. And look at how much of this body is occupied by the egg. In fact, you can imagine there's very little room for anything else. And when I see this, I always think this must have been a tremendous relief when this kiwi lays its egg. So 15 to 20% of a mother's body weight. So for a 120-pound woman, that would be like giving birth to an 18 to 24-pound baby. Scale that up, of course, for a bigger woman, it's even a bigger baby. Here are the different kinds of kiwis. Of course, these are stuffed models in the Wellington National Museum, but it allowed me to see some of the variety. So these are throughout the forest floor. I talked to you about some extinct birds. Here we're looking at a map and showing some of the distribution. This is various things off the internet. So I've given some credit down here at the bottom, but this is showing you some of the size of these kiwis and some of the biggest ones towering over a human being. There's good evidence that Maoris hunted these animals to extinction. We have found their bones associated with Maori cultures. There's traditions that we know about. They've found the eggs and eggshells associated with Maori burial sites. And it's very, very sad. In fact, for me, I had hoped that the native Maori would have had more sustainable kinds of practices and that they would have noticed declining population and left them alone. But apparently that didn't happen because moas, all these different species, were gone before non-native people arrived in New Zealand. So this was very sad to me. Here we've got a whole extinct assemblage of birds. These are mounted skeletons, right just to the left, just over here to the left of where these mounted skeletons are located was a real moa bone. And you could really put your hand on a moa bone. And that just, I don't know, it just really touched me to think of these great birds and their cause of extinction is us. And it was very shameful for me. Here a bit more. This is the other end of that mounted skeleton, showing you some of the other views of the animal's body, the very great legs. If you've ever eaten a drumstick on a chicken, you'll know there's actually two bones on a drumstick. There's the great big leg bone, and then there's this little bitty thing over here, the fibula, that comes in the side. It kind of comes to a tip. It runs along with the drumstick. That's that part of a moa. Here's footprint, and then here, as I mentioned already, a burial site from 1939 where we find this moa egg, and it's huge. It's coming close to the size of a basketball. Maybe better to say size of a soccer ball. Also in this Wellington Museum, we're talking about some of the critters, so you can read the sign. But this is a giant squid, and it's huge. And it says that this is the biggest ever caught and the most complete one on display anywhere in the world. It's just huge. And so here it is in a tank preserved, and you can get to see that. As we're making our way onto Wellington, and we're in the very south part of the North Island, we had to cross a mountain range. And this mountain range had to be crossed to get in and out by land to Wellington, the capital city. Now, Wellington is a port, so you can get to Wellington by sea, but if you get to it by land, they had to cross this mountain range. And so it was really quite an adventure. Again, it's a two-lane road. You have to drive on the left. And for me, that was really something to bear in mind and to not hit the other cars. In any case, here somebody took our picture for us. Looks like we're perched on a stump. The car is coming by. This is one of the passes in the mountains. And I also show this because one of the neat things that happens when you're on this kind of trip is that you get to any spot like this for pictures and you meet people and everybody is so friendly and where are you from and sort of what do you do and why are you here and what brought you to New Zealand. And we met so many different people, very few from the United States. It's generally what I found in China, when I was in Russia with Amy on some tours, in Northern Europe, and in Iceland. There just aren't that many Americans compared to other people from around the world. So it's really neat to get to meet so many different kinds of people. And we're almost all on holiday, so we're all quite relaxed and you can really have some pleasant conversations. Well, I mentioned Wellington, capital city, and said it's a port city. So we made it here. We stayed somewhere down here in one of these hotels, and they have a trolley that comes up a very, very steep slope so that you can be on top of this mountain that's, the high point of Wellington. There's parks up there, and I'll tell you about a nature preserve that I've already mentioned a little bit. So here's the little trolley system that's moving up and down. You take your way up and you get off, and it's a wonderful view of the city. This also was something unexpected. We got to Wellington and they threw this great big party for us. We didn't expect it, but it was nice. It was nice. Actually, what this is a giant room that's an art exhibit. And it's confetti, but the confetti is suspended in the air by little bitty wires. And so you walk up to the front of this room and it looks like there's confetti coming down, but it's just stuck there. And so, no, they didn't really throw a party for us. Oh yeah, and Amy got ice cream. So this is the shoreline of Wellington. Well, around Wellington, at the top of that trolley, was a place called Zealandia. And Zealandia is a place that was we found out later, it was a water reservoir. So there's a couple big lakes up there, not really lakes, they're more like ponds with dams. And that was going to be the water source for Wellington. And then they thought about it and realized that with all the volcanic and tectonic activity, that earthquakes were pretty likely, and earthquakes could break the dams and a whole bunch of water would come cascading down onto downtown Wellington. And so as they rethought their water systems, freshwater systems, they decided instead to make this a giant nature preserve. And so they put a fence, a great big fence around this area. It's about a square mile in size. And then they did all they could to eliminate the invasive species. And they brought back tuatars and they released them. They have some tuatars that are in cages and others they allowed to roam free. And in the last 10 years, they've had tuatars breeding in the open areas. So it's a real good sign that they know what they need to do to help the tuatars reproduce. Here is part of us in the enclosure. We had a tour guide, and that's the barrier, the wall. So this is outside of the enclosure, Zealandia, and this is inside the Zealandia enclosure. So here you go, 12 years ago they had their first breeding tuatars. The tuatars are tagged, and so here I'm just looking down on one. I was standing on a fence that enclosed a big area for tuatars, and they were walking down underneath us. Here's more of that valley, really, that is Zealandia. There's one of the water reservoirs. I'm told that they're probably going to drain those ponds and reduce the risk. But here's these giant tree ferns again. Here one in the canopy. I just was really impressed. You just don't see a lot of that in Illinois. We had a tour guide, took us through, pointing out all kinds of things. They can be experts in all sorts of areas. But I spotted this. and I yelled out with glee, liverworts! And so I took some pictures and got Dr. Bray to confirm that in fact these are liverworts. And I guess it's a pretty common kind of a liverwort. Dr. Bray wasn't overly excited, but I was hoping that he could see pictures and confirm that I was able to identify this member of the botanical world. All right, so here's where Wellington's at. We're about to catch a ferry and make our way over to Picton. These are always a little nerve-wracking for me. You know, you got to catch a ferry at the right time. We had to turn in the rental car. Well, when we got there were parking lots all over at the ferry terminal, and there was absolutely no place to park a car. Apparently, lots of people were returning their rental cars. And so what do? You got to catch the ferry. What are you going to do with a rental car? You can't even find somebody to give the keys to. So I'm driving around, a little frantic for 20 minutes, and finally a guy's waving to us, and I said, where do I park? And he said, come up on the sidewalk. And I said, what do I do with the keys? And he said, just leave them in the car. So in the middle of that mess, it turned out to be pretty easy to turn in the car. And now that many months have passed, apparently it worked because nobody got a hold of me and said, hey, buddy, when are you going to turn in your car? So it was very, very busy. And, you know, it's what happens when you travel. You got to figure stuff out. So we took a big ferry to the South Island. It was about a 3.5-hour cruise. We sat down on one end of the boat with a really good view and sat next to a family from Wellington. So it was a mom and dad and their kids. It turned out that the man worked in the government in Wellington, and we had a wonderful conversation. And he followed American politics very, very closely. And we talked a lot, and it was just really fun to get to know people and to have that much time to spend visiting. Here we are coming into the Picton Harbor. That's the boat we came in on. I jumped out of the boat and swam as fast as I could and climbed this hillside and took a picture of our boat coming in to the Picton Harbor right here. Or the next day as we left Picton, we drove along to that spot and I took a picture of the ferry coming in the next day. I'm trying to remember which it was. I think I swam it. In any case, this is this beautiful Picton Harbor if you take the ferry. The hillsides are undeveloped, and there's a good reason why. And my understanding is, working with the Maori, these hillsides were not developed commercially. Some of the wood may be harvested, but that you can look out and see these beautiful hillsides and not see houses perched all along here. And I just found this to be just a beautiful place. So we had dinner here by the beach. I thought, gosh, the harbor where the ferry comes in is going to be very commercialized and not a very pretty place. But instead, this is what it was. And in fact, as we walked around the town, I looked into the price of buying a home here. And it turns out that I would have to sell my current home and spend most of my retirement savings to buy up a spot here. But it's really a beautiful place to visit. That's it for the trip then from Rotorua to Picton. That ends episode 2 of 4. I'll pick up our adventures from Picton on the next show.